Victor Okoye dropped the funeral program when he heard his daughter say it. "I'm glad my father is dead." The church fell into stunned silence. But no one noticed the quiet old man sitting in the back row, gripping the pew like his life depended on it. Because the man everyone came to bury that morning was sitting right there in the room, listening. People shifted in their seats. A few gasped quietly. One man coughed awkwardly, unsure if he had heard her correctly. At the front of the church, Delight Okoye stood at the podium, calm but firm, holding the microphone with steady hands. Her eyes scanned the room slowly. Executives, family friends, politicians. Every single one of them had come to mourn Victor Okoye. None of them realized the quiet old man sitting 10 rows behind them was the very man they believed was dead. Victor lowered his head slightly beneath the brim of his hat. He had expected many things when he decided to attend his own funeral, but he had not expected his daughter to begin her speech like that. Delight let the silence stretch for a few seconds longer. She could feel the tension in the room. People were staring at her now. Some shocked, some curious, some clearly uncomfortable. She took a slow breath and leaned closer to the microphone. "I know that sounded harsh," she said calmly. "But I'm not here to lie." A murmur moved through the audience. Victor felt the words settle heavily in his chest. At the podium, Delight continued. "My father was many things. Brilliant, powerful, successful." She gestured lightly toward the large portrait of Victor displayed beside the casket. "Most of you knew him as a business legend." Several executives nodded quietly. "But that wasn't the man I knew." Victor's fingers tightened around the edge of the pew. Behind him, someone whispered, "This is getting uncomfortable." Another voice replied softly, "Let her speak." Delight looked out across the room again. "When I was 8 years old, I had a school play." A few people exchanged confused glances. Delight smiled faintly. "I wasn't the star. I wasn't even a main character." She paused. "I was a tree." Some light laughter rippled across the room, but it faded quickly. "But it was the most important tree in the forest," she added softly. Victor closed his eyes. He remembered that play, or at least, he remembered the phone call about it. Delight continued. "I practiced my lines for weeks." She looked down briefly, as if seeing the memory clearly in her mind. "I kept asking my father if he would come." Victor shifted slightly in his seat. At the time, he had been negotiating a major deal in London, a deal that would eventually earn him hundreds of millions. "I remember standing backstage," Delight said quietly. "I kept looking at the door." The church was silent now. "I was waiting for him." Victor's jaw tightened. "He promised he'd be there." She lifted her eyes toward the audience. "But he never came." The words echoed through the room. Victor exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of every eye in the church, even though none of them knew he was there. Delight continued speaking, her voice steady. "That night, I learned something important about my father." She folded her hands together. "He always had time for business." Her expression hardened slightly. "Just never for us." Victor stared down at the floor. If you're captivated by this story so far, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people hear stories like Victor's. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapters of powerful stories that make you think about life, family,
and choices. Delight glanced once more at the portrait beside the casket. I didn't hate my father. Victor looked up. I just stopped expecting him to love us. The words landed harder than anything she had said before. A heavy silence filled the church. Delight stepped back from the microphone slightly. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I hope he finally found peace. She placed the microphone back on the stand. Then she walked slowly back to her seat. Victor watched her the entire time. His chest felt tight. He had built an empire worth billions, companies across continents, thousands of employees. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. Near the front row, Richard Cole slowly stood up. Victor straightened slightly in his seat. If anyone in this room truly knew him, it was Richard. Richard walked calmly to the podium and adjusted the microphone. He glanced briefly toward Delight before looking out at the crowd. Well, he said slowly, that was honest. A few uneasy chuckles moved through the room. Richard placed both hands on the podium. I worked with Victor Okoye for 35 years. He paused. And if there's one thing everyone here should understand about Victor, he leaned slightly closer to the microphone. It's that he trusted absolutely no one. Several people nodded. Richard shrugged. And honestly, he had good reasons. Victor felt his chest tighten again, because whatever Richard said next was about to reveal a side of Victor Okoye that even his own daughter had never seen. And Victor wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. Richard adjusted the microphone again and looked around the church. For those of you who only knew Victor from headlines, he said, let me explain something. He paused, glancing briefly at the portrait beside the casket. Victor Okoye didn't build his empire by being liked.
A few people nodded quietly. He built it by being feared. Victor sat perfectly still in the back row. Richard continued. Most people in business want to be respected. He gave a faint smile. Victor preferred something stronger. What's that? Someone muttered quietly from the audience. Richard answered the unspoken question. Control. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Richard leaned casually on the podium. Victor believed that trust was the most dangerous thing in the world. He looked out over the audience. He used to tell me something all the time. Richard straightened slightly and imitated Victor's calm voice. Richard, the moment you trust someone completely, you give them the power to destroy you. A few executives chuckled softly. Victor remembered saying that countless times. Richard continued. And honestly, he said with a shrug, he wasn't wrong. Victor shifted slightly in his seat. Richard's tone softened. But here's the truth about Victor that most people don't understand. The church grew quiet again. Richard pointed lightly toward the portrait. Behind that reputation was a man who worked harder than anyone I've ever met. Victor watched carefully now. He slept maybe 4 hours a night, Richard said. He read every contract personally. And if something went wrong in the company, he didn't blame anyone else. He fixed it himself. Several employees nodded in agreement. Richard smiled faintly. But he was also the most stubborn man I've ever known. More laughter moved through the room. Victor allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all.
But Richard wasn't finished. His voice shifted again. Victor had a rule when it came to business. He raised one finger. Never let emotions interfere with decisions. Victor knew that rule well. He had lived by it for decades. Richard continued. And the problem with that rule, he paused, is that eventually it doesn't just apply to business. The room grew quiet again. Richard looked toward Delight briefly. Eventually, it applies to everything. Victor felt that sentence land heavily. Richard sighed. I told Victor something once. He leaned closer to the microphone. I said, one day you're going to wake up with everything in the world, except the people who matter. A few people shifted in their seats. Richard shrugged slightly. He didn't listen. Victor stared at the floor, because Richard had said that 10 years ago. Victor had laughed it off at the time. At the podium, Richard continued. Now don't misunderstand me. He gestured toward the room. Victor helped a lot of people. Several heads lifted. Richard continued calmly. But the strange thing about Victor was, he never wanted anyone to know about it. Victor's eyes lifted slightly. Richard looked around the room. Most billionaires donate money and put their names on buildings, he shrugged. Victor preferred to stay invisible. Some people looked confused. Let me give you an example, Richard said. About 6 years ago, one of our employees had a daughter who needed emergency surgery. A few employees in the audience began listening more closely. The cost was enormous. Richard paused. The man couldn't afford it. Victor felt his chest tighten slightly. Richard continued. Victor called me into his office. He smiled faintly at the memory. He slid a file across the desk and said, "Take care of it." Richard looked at the audience. He paid the entire hospital bill. Several people murmured. But he made me promise something, Richard added, that no one would ever know. Victor lowered his head slightly. He had always believed charity should be quiet. Richard shrugged again. That's just one story. He looked around the room slowly. There are dozens more. The audience stirred slightly. But the strange thing is, most of the people he helped never knew it was him. Victor stared at the back of the pew in front of him. For a moment, he felt something close to relief. Maybe this funeral wouldn't be completely painful. But Richard wasn't finished yet. He leaned closer to the microphone again. The truth about Victor Okoye is complicated. He gestured lightly toward the portrait. He could be generous. Then he looked toward Delight. But he could also be distant. Victor felt that word settle in his chest. Richard sighed softly. I think the problem was simple. The room waited.
Victor believed providing money was the same thing as providing love. Several people nodded slowly. Richard shook his head. It isn't. Victor's fingers tightened again around the pew. Richard continued quietly. You can build companies. You can build wealth. You can even build an empire. He paused. But if you're not careful, he looked directly toward Delight. You might forget to build a family. The words echoed through the church. Victor closed his eyes again. Richard stepped back from the microphone slightly. I won't pretend Victor was a perfect man. He glanced around the room. He wasn't. But he was the most determined man I ever met. Richard looked at the portrait one last time. And despite everything, he was still my friend. He nodded once. Thank you. The church remained silent for a moment before soft applause began. Victor stayed completely still. Richard's words echoed in his mind. Providing money is not the same as providing love. He had heard that before, from his wife, years ago, before she left. Victor inhaled slowly. He had come to this funeral expecting honesty, but he had not expected it to feel like this. Like every word was peeling back a part of his life he had carefully hidden. At the front of the church, the pastor stood and walked slowly toward the microphone. "We will now open the floor," the pastor said gently. "If anyone else would like to share a memory of Victor Okoye." For a moment, no one moved. Then something unexpected happened. A man slowly stood from the back row near the side aisle. Victor glanced toward him. The man looked nervous. He wore a simple uniform, a janitor's uniform. He hesitated before raising his hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said softly. The pastor looked surprised. "Yes?" The man stepped into the aisle. "My name is Samuel Adeyemi," he said. His voice shook slightly. "I know I'm not supposed to speak today." Several people turned to look at him. Samuel swallowed nervously. "But I think people here should hear something about Mr. Okoye." Victor straightened slightly in his seat, because he had never seen this man before in his life. Samuel slowly walked toward the podium, and Victor had no idea that the next 5 minutes were about to change everything he thought he knew about himself. Samuel Adeyemi stood at the podium, gripping the microphone with both hands. For a moment, he said nothing. He looked out at the room full of executives in expensive suits, polished shoes, and quiet authority. Then he cleared his throat. "I work here," he said softly. "At the church." He gestured awkwardly toward the side of the hall. "I clean the building. I take care of the grounds." A few people nodded politely. Samuel shifted his weight. "I didn't know Mr. Okoye personally," he continued. "At least, not the way most of you did."
Victor watched him carefully from the back row, his brow furrowed slightly, because Samuel was right. Victor had never spoken to him before. At least he didn't think he had. Samuel glanced down at his hands. "But 6 years ago," he said slowly, "something happened to my family." The room grew quiet again. "My wife got very sick." Samuel's voice trembled slightly now. "The doctors said she needed surgery immediately." He swallowed hard. "But the cost," he shook his head. "It was more money than I had ever seen in my life." Several people in the audience leaned forward slightly. Samuel continued. "I remember sitting in the hospital hallway with the bill in my hands." He exhaled slowly. "I felt completely helpless." Victor sat perfectly still. Samuel continued. "I had already sold my car. I borrowed money from friends. I even tried taking 2 extra jobs." He shook his head again. But it still wasn't enough. The room was silent. Samuel looked toward the portrait of Victor. And then, one day, the hospital called me. His voice softened. "They told me the surgery had been paid for." A small murmur spread through the room. Samuel nodded slowly. "I thought it was a mistake. I asked them 3 times, but they said it was true. The surgery was completely covered." Samuel continued. "My wife survived because of that." He wiped his hands on his uniform nervously. "But the strange thing was," he looked around the room, "they wouldn't tell me who paid for it." Victor lowered his gaze. Samuel continued quietly. "I spent weeks trying to find out. I asked the hospital. I asked the billing department. I even asked the doctor." He smiled faintly. "But nobody would tell me." Samuel paused again. "Until one day, someone finally did." The room leaned in. Samuel pointed gently toward the portrait of Victor Okoye. It was him. A wave of murmurs moved through the church. Samuel nodded slowly. Yes. Victor's chest tightened. Samuel continued. But when I finally got the chance to thank him, he smiled sadly. He told me something I'll never forget. Victor's hands tightened again. Samuel leaned closer to the microphone. He said, "Don't thank me." Samuel paused. He said, "Just take care of your wife." Several people in the audience exchanged surprised glances. Samuel looked down briefly. And then he told me something else. Victor felt a strange uneasiness rising in his chest. Samuel continued. He told me never to tell anyone. The room went completely silent. Samuel nodded. He said he didn't want recognition. He didn't want praise. He just wanted to help. Samuel took a slow breath. So, for 6 years, I kept that promise. He looked around the room again. But today, everyone here is talking about the kind of man Mr. Okoye was. Samuel's voice grew firmer. And I think people should know the whole truth. Victor sat frozen. Samuel continued. Because the man who saved my wife's life, he gestured again toward the portrait, was not a heartless man. The room was completely silent now. Samuel wiped his eyes quickly. I know he wasn't perfect. He looked toward Delight gently. I'm not here to argue with his daughter. Delight watched him carefully from her seat. Samuel continued. But I am here to say that sometimes, he paused, people do good things quietly. Victor felt something shift inside him. Samuel stepped back slightly from the microphone. But that's not the only story. The room stirred again. Samuel looked around slowly. 3 years ago, another man at my church lost his house. A few people leaned forward again. He worked security at one of Mr. Okoye's companies. Samuel nodded. His wife had cancer. Medical bills destroyed them. He paused. They were about to be evicted. Samuel pointed gently toward the portrait again. And somehow, Mr. Okoye found out. Victor's breathing slowed. Samuel continued. The next week, the man's mortgage was paid. Gasps rippled through the audience. Samuel shrugged slightly. Again, no one knew who did it. He looked at the portrait. But I did. Victor felt his chest tighten again. Samuel's voice softened. I've seen a lot of wealthy people in my life, but very few of them help others without wanting the world to know. The church was quiet again. Samuel looked down at the podium for a moment. Then he lifted his head. So, when I heard people here today saying Mr. Okoye had no heart, he shook his head slowly. That didn't sound like the man I knew? Victor stared at the floor. Something heavy pressed against his chest. Not guilt. Something else. Samuel continued quietly. I think sometimes, he paused, the kindest things people do are the ones nobody sees. The pastor stepped forward slightly, clearly moved. Thank you, Samuel, he said gently. Samuel nodded and began stepping away from the podium. But before he could leave, another voice suddenly spoke. Wait. Everyone turned. Richard Cole was standing again. He looked at Samuel carefully. Samuel, he said slowly, how many people know those stories? Samuel shook his head. Not many. Richard looked around the room. Then I think there's something everyone here should understand. He stepped toward the microphone again. Because what Samuel just said, he paused, is only part of the story. Victor's eyes lifted slowly, because the tone in Richard's voice had changed. And suddenly, Victor had a terrible feeling that something else was about to be revealed, something he had never planned for anyone to know. Richard leaned toward the microphone again. 6 months ago, he said quietly, Victor Okoye did something that shocked even me. The entire room leaned forward, and Victor felt his pulse begin to rise, because whatever Richard was about to say was not part of the life Victor thought anyone understood. And for the first time since the funeral began, Victor Okoye was afraid of what might come next. Richard Cole stood quietly at the podium for a moment, letting the silence settle over the room. Samuel stepped aside but remained near the front, unsure whether to return to his seat. Richard looked around slowly. I didn't plan to say this today, he said. But after hearing Samuel speak, I think people deserve to understand something about Victor. Victor sat rigid in the back row. His pulse thudded in his ears. Richard continued. 6 months ago, Victor called me into his office late at night. He rested both hands on the podium. It was almost midnight. The building was empty. Victor remembered that night clearly. Richard went on. When I walked in, Victor was sitting at his desk staring at the city. He gestured toward the windows of the church as if the skyline were right outside. He looked different. Richard paused. I had never seen him like that before. Victor felt his stomach tighten. Richard continued. I asked him what was wrong. He smiled faintly. And Victor said something I never expected to hear. Richard looked around the room. He said, Richard, I think I built the wrong kind of empire. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Victor lowered his head slightly. Richard continued. I thought he was joking. He shrugged. But Victor wasn't joking. Richard leaned closer to the microphone. He said, I spent 40 years building companies. Richard paused. And somewhere along the way, I forgot to build a life. Victor felt the words land deep inside him. Richard glanced briefly toward Delight. And then he asked me something. He paused again. He asked me if I thought it was too late. The church was silent. Richard shook his head slowly. I told him something I still believe. He looked out at the crowd. I said, it's never too late to become a better man. Victor felt something tighten in his chest again. Richard continued quietly. But the strange thing is, he hesitated. Victor didn't look relieved. He paused. He looked afraid. A murmur moved through the room. Richard sighed. Victor said something else that night. He straightened slightly. He said, I don't know how to fix what I broke. Victor closed his eyes. Richard continued. And honestly, I didn't have an answer for him. The church remained completely still. Richard looked toward the portrait beside the casket. Victor Okoye built one of the most powerful companies in this country. He gestured lightly. But sometimes, success comes with a price. His eyes moved toward Delight again. And sometimes, that price is paid by the people closest to you. Delight sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Richard stepped back from the microphone. For what it's worth, he said softly. I think Victor knew that. He nodded once. And I think he was starting to regret it. Richard stepped away from the podium. The room sat in heavy silence. Victor stared down at his hands. He had come here to hear the truth. Now he had it. Every word, every memory, every regret. He slowly stood from the back row. The movement caught the attention of the people sitting near him. A few turned to look at the quiet old man rising from the pew. Victor took a slow breath. For the first time since the funeral began, he removed the hat from his head. Someone near the aisle gasped. The whisper spread quickly. Wait, that looks like... No, it can't be. Victor stepped into the aisle. Dozens of eyes turned toward him now. Confusion rippled through the church. Delight looked up from her seat. Her eyes widened. Victor walked slowly toward the front. Every step felt heavier than the last. The pastor stared at him in shock. Mr. Okoye? Victor stopped beside the podium. The room had gone completely silent. He looked around at the crowd, executives,
Employees, friends, strangers, people who thought they were attending his funeral. Victor finally spoke. I suppose, he said quietly, this is the part where things get awkward. A stunned wave of whispers spread across the church. Richard Cole stared at him, speechless. Samuel Adeyemi looked like he had seen a ghost. Delight slowly stood from her seat. Her voice trembled. Dad? Victor turned toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victor said the one thing he had never said enough. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air. Delight stared at him. Victor continued quietly.
I heard everything you said today. He glanced around the room. And you were right. His voice was steady but heavy. I built an empire. He paused. But I failed at the things that mattered most. Delight's eyes filled with emotion. Victor took a slow step toward her. I can't change the past. His voice softened. But if there's still time, he hesitated. I'd like to try to change the future. The room remained silent. Delight studied his face carefully. For the first time in years, Victor Okoye looked uncertain. Not powerful, not intimidating, just human. Finally, Delight spoke. You faked your death, just to hear the truth. Victor nodded slowly. Yes. She shook her head in disbelief. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. A few people in the audience chuckled nervously. Then Delight took a slow breath. But at least now you know. Victor nodded again. Yes. Silence filled the space between them. Then, after a long moment, Delight stepped forward and hugged him. A quiet murmur moved through the church. Victor closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, he felt something more valuable than power. Forgiveness. He pulled back slightly and looked around the room. I owe all of you an explanation, he said. But more importantly, he glanced toward Samuel. I owe some of you my gratitude. Samuel looked stunned. Victor smiled faintly. And Samuel, thank you for breaking your promise today. The room laughed softly. Victor turned back toward the crowd. I spent most of my life believing success was about building the biggest empire. He shook his head. I was wrong. He looked around the room again. Success is about the people you build along the way. Victor took a deep breath. So here's what happens next. The room leaned in. Starting today, I'm stepping down as CEO of Okoye Holdings. Gasps filled the church. Victor continued. And I'm starting something new. He glanced toward Delight again. A foundation that will help families who can't afford medical care. Samuel covered his mouth in shock. Victor smiled slightly. I think that's a better legacy. The room slowly began to applaud. Victor looked out at them one last time. And if today's story taught you anything, he paused. Let it be this. Don't wait until your funeral to hear the truth about your life. The applause grew louder. Victor turned toward Delight again. This time she smiled. And as the room filled with emotion and conversation, one thing became clear. Victor Okoye had come to his own funeral expecting to hear the end of his story. Instead, it had given him a second chance to begin a new one. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that save us. Sometimes the words we fear the most are the ones we need to hear. So if this story moved you, take a moment right now to like the video, because it really helps more people discover stories like this. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy powerful stories that make you think about life, family, and the choices we make. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Now tell me something in the comments. If you were at Victor Okoye's funeral, what would you have said about him? Your answer might be more powerful than you think. And remember, the story of a life isn't written by wealth or power. It's written by the people who remember you when you're gone.